Welcome to the Compact Podcast. Today we'll discuss Trump's mineral deal with Ukraine, the victory of the Liberal candidate in Canada's elections, and power outages in Spain. I'm joined by Ashley Frawley and Geoff Shullenberger, and I'm Matthew Schmitz. So news came this week that Trump has finally signed a mineral deal with Ukraine. This is the compact that Zelensky had come to the White House to sign before leaving with his lunch uneaten after the arguments in the Oval Office. We have some initial details of the deal. It seems that the Trump administration bent a little bit. It's no longer demanding that the support the U.S. has given Ukraine be treated as a debt in need of repayment. But the Trump administration can now basically say, look, we are getting something out of our involvement in the country. The American people stand to benefit financially. And they can also say to Ukrainian leaders, the fact that U.S. will have a direct financial stake in your resources in your country is going to be its own kind of implicit security guarantee by aligning our interests with yours. So I think this minerals deal, which also includes, I should say, natural gas, oil, whatever kind of energy resources Ukraine has, brings us back to an earlier episode in the Ukraine saga, and that is Hunter Biden's involvement in Burisma, where he sat on the company's board, is seen by many as lacking real qualifications in the energy sector. I wouldn't want to insist that everyone has to have a PhD to get involved in the business, but a lot of people think that the real value of Hunter Biden was his connection to Joe, at that time Barack Obama's vice president, and someone who himself took a very close interest in Ukraine. And I think it's worth recalling that episode to put in context what is often described as Trump's transactional foreign policy. Now, without suggesting that the Trump clan doesn't have its own forms of corruption and kind of advantage seeking, I think this is a step forward because there's a attitude about U.S. foreign policy that says, look, we shouldn't be transactional. We shouldn't seek immediate benefit from these deals we're making in foreign policy, the support that we're offering for foreign countries. It should be done for high-minded, unselfish reasons. It's a very nice idea, but generally people do things for concrete material benefits. It's really profoundly motivating. And I think that a foreign policy that's more directly transactional, saying, look, you're going to have to benefit our nation in this way, is possibly a way to counterbalance and maybe even suppress some of the temptations toward corruption that might arise in a wholly idealistic foreign policy. If someone's going to get paid, some kind of financial exchange is going to take place, I tend to think. And my hope, however, kind of doubtful it may be, is that by formalizing agreements like this one with other countries where the American people as a whole are ostensibly going to benefit, that we can create, kind of public, formal, transparent incentives that might help cut against some of the subterranean incentives that probably keep the American ruling class running. So that's my kind of two cheers for transactional foreign policy. Basically, a transaction's always going to take place. Maybe it's through Hunter Biden and giving him millions that he can stuff into his crack pipe, or maybe it's in a formalized deal with where we set up an investment vehicle in the name of the U.S. taxpayer. And if idealistic foreign policy is always going to be accompanied by some version of the first, I would rather have a transactional foreign policy So then, at least if the American people have a direct stake in the country's finances, that might increase some incentives from the American side to scrutinize any other forms of corruption that spring up. So, maybe that's a little baroque, that form of argument. Maybe it's a little bit too hopeful, but I just kind of think there's something good about a transactional foreign policy.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there's something to be said for just sort of nakedly putting, the self-interest on the table. It has a powerfully democratic side to it. We've talked about this before, where it seems to be the end of all these big lofty claims that we saw at the start. Policymakers that were talking disdainfully about low information voters, all of it, or like and the need to sort of defer to experts and so on. All of a sudden, as soon as COVID ended, Ukraine war begins, they said, this is about democracy, this is about democracy. And it made no sense. It meant nothing to anybody, and it fell really flat. And I really enjoy the nakedness of, like, let's make a deal. I want your mineral deposits, and it sort of includes the American people, the Ukrainian people. We know what it's about. There are no lies. And, well, I mean, I'm sure there are always lies, as there tend to be. But at least the sort of the interests of the parties are on the table. Then we know what we're negotiating about. And it sort of brings in that democratic edge that capitalism in its glory was meant to have.
This brings me back to, I think I've brought this up before in this context, but one of Trump's original arguments in his 2016 campaign, when he shockingly broke with the party consensus on the at least good intentions behind the Iraq war, even if things hadn't gone as hoped for, and significantly came out swinging against the party establishment, George W. Bush on down, that had pursued that adventure. And basically, one of his lines, which was much cited at the time, was "We should have taken the oil," which I always found like a really weird notion, because it sounded as if he was saying we should have like sucked it all out of the ground and then just like put it in barrels and taken it away.
I think in the past on this
But
podcast, we've discussed this as, instead of no blood for oil, kind of blood for oil.
right, exactly. So yeah, so it's so I think here we see basically an attempt to enact this as a principle of foreign policy, right? That when we engage in some kind of foreign, when we engage in some kind of foreign armed conflict, we want something to show for it materially. And so this is a kind of a paradigm shift in terms of how empire is understood, which I think is important. I mean, this is something Christian Parenti has written about, that there was kind of a logic to how empire functioned for many decades, which it's not that there weren't material concerns at stake. It's more that this was not made explicit or framed as the major concern. And this isn't just the Bush. This isn't just this kind of Bush neocon adventurism, but going back to the Cold War. I think here with this minerals deal, I thought of various Latin American countries and their struggles over natural resources, and the way that the way that this worked was usually a little bit more kind of under the radar, although everybody in these countries, or most people in these countries, sort of understood what was really going on, which is that the US would say that what it was interested in was democracy, right? And what it was interested in was democracy, freedom, free enterprise. Whereas in reality, what you had was, say, in Chile, where I used to live, these vast copper resources, which still make up a large portion of Chile's GDP. despite it being a relatively diversified economy in the region, which were owned by a U.S. The copper resources in Chile for many years were owned by a U.S. Company, and this company had close ties to the various parts of the U.S. government. And so, protecting the investments of major U.S. corporations was a significant part of foreign policy. You can think of, United Fruit as another major American enterprise that, was often the subtext of various kind of foreign policy involvements, right? The United Fruit had huge investments in banana plantations in Colombia, Guatemala, other places. And so, part of what the US government was doing when it said it was promoting democracy, freedom, free enterprise was specifically protecting the material interests of these entities and specifically protecting them from nationalization, which was a policy that was repeatedly implemented and in some cases was then reversed after military coups. But probably the most notable example was the nationalization of oil in Mexico, which happened in the 1930s, and which FDR notably decided not to, do a coup or a military invasion, which the U.S. had invaded Mexico a couple decades earlier. So, FDR at that point chose to allow Mexico to nationalize its oil, but numerous other cases of nationalization or threatened nationalization were a cause of coups. And so it is worth noting, something about about this minerals deal is it does, create this kind of explicit vassal relationship, which if I suppose the U.S. is seen as a benefactor and is still seen as a benevolent force vis-a-vis Russia, which is the greater enemy to Ukrainian defenders of Ukrainian sovereignty, then I suppose this might be seen as an acceptable trade-off, right? To explicitly kind of sell off a portion of your natural resources in exchange for this kind of protection. And so, yeah, I mean, it's interesting on one hand, as others were saying, that there is a kind of refreshing explicitness about this arrangement, that it's being made brought out in the open. What again in these kind of cases of Latin American resource colonies was sort of hidden under this rhetoric of democracy and freedom, whereas the majority of people really understood what was actually going on. And so my only sort of question here is whether this kind of cynical logic actually works as a long-term ideology of empire, right? In other words, if you just if you remove the patina of any ideals and just turn it into this kind of brutal calculus of resource extraction, like, does that work as a means of legitimizing a particular set of power relations, especially beyond the particulars of this conflict? So that's kind of what I'm interested in.
I think it's a great question, because one way to view Trump's second term, especially where he's done things like draw down USAID, attack other forms of foreign aid, whatever, things like PEPFAR, where we're fighting AIDS in Africa. These are programs that, in addition to their real world financial effects, have a powerful ideological legitimating effect. And so there are obviously attempts to describe a specific Trump ideology or viewpoint. A term that's often referred to as, or a term that's often used, is nationalism, or maybe we could say in this context kind of transactional imperialism. But I think you raised a great question: is that really enough, or does one need to invoke some kind of higher ideal just because there's going to be a demand for that? And if the answer is yes, that means that some ideal will rush into this vacuum, whether it's a return to some kind of liberal progressive internationalism, kind of high-minded, or I don't know, some kind of more another possibility and distinction to that progressive vision would be something that is more like the U.S. as the champion of religious freedom. Imagine, religious freedom would be a term that could help coordinate uh, the beliefs of more religious and traditional Americans with a kind of crusading liberal empire, because the U.S. could present itself as fighting tyranny to support the rights of religious believers, right? So possibly we'll see that. I think that's your suggestion. Is that right, Jeff? We'll see something eventually come in.
Yeah, I tend to think so, but then I suppose my sort of Baudrillardian twist might be something along the lines of, this is itself a kind of like that the ideology of cynical realism, kind of hard realism, is itself some kind of ruse. And so, the question then is what that is concealing, right? I mean, this is also a point that Zizek has discussed, right? That that cynicism can itself become a kind of ideological mask, and so then you have to kind of dig beneath and figure out, like, whereas the traditional operation of ideological critique is to say, what are the crude, vulgar material interests beneath this kind of surface layer of lofty idealism. The reverse operation becomes, what are the ideals beneath this cynical, harsh realism? Like, what are the actual deeper, sort of commitments that are driving this?
Maybe not now, but for the answer to that question, readers can subscribe to the Compact Substack, and Jeff will explain it all in his next issue this Friday.
Well, you know what? I had something else that I was going to say, and you've just made me think. And this has been the common thing, the common thread now, because I was going to write about the Canadian election, and then we had two great articles in Compact that said the complete opposite of what I would have said, and it made me. But
great and completely wrong, right, Ashley?
No, it really made me. Maybe if I had sat there and like actually got to write the column, I might have rethought in the process. But I was going to say it's like the end of the technocratic order, and we had these great articles that were like sort of saying, no, this is its triumph, and maybe it should rule. But anyway, so what you've just said is so check those articles out. But what you've just said made me think perhaps it's that the underlying the cynical idea is the free market as an ideal, or the market solves problems as an ideal long after it can't. And that is the complete opposite of what I was just about to say. And that is actually really concerning for me, because my big worry when I saw this deal is that this is the kind of same old thing. You have a conflict, you destroy everything, and but on of course a much smaller scale. You got a crisis situation, it's hard to find profit, so what do? You blow things up. You blow up the old sort of manufacturing and the old infrastructure, and you rebuild it again, and you radically revolutionize it when you couldn't before because it wouldn't have been profitable to do so. And I have a sneaking suspicion that this is partly also what is fueling the desire to bring manufacture to the United States. Nobody wants to pay factory workers good wages. That makes no sense at all. So what could they possibly be doing? They might be trying to, screw over China, and because it's not profitable to bring in a lot of automation when you've got really, really cheap labor in China and Bangladesh and all these places. So, but they want to automate. So just get them out of the equation and rebuild in America fully automated, as automated as possible. That might be what they're doing. But then I was sort of looking at the numbers here, and I was like, on this deal, it's not enough. It's not that profitable. We're talking like how many people died. It's not that much money, and I was thinking like perhaps it is, this cynicism is like a way of kind of going to the market as something that solves problems and doing it nakedly and openly, although the AI thing is and the automation thing is not that naked or open, but at a long after it can't, long after it can't. And that is extremely worrying because we don't have anything else. There's, it just means more destruction, more destruction. Keep doing these horrible deals that won't really up the profits enough to make it profitable to invest and rebuild and so on. And where does that leave us? Even bigger wars? I don't know. But I'm going to say the thing that I was going to say, which is that on the other hand, for a long time, there was this kind of nostalgia for the Cold War, right? So the Berlin Wall falls, and you've got, the Cold War. It was about, and the Second World War. These were conflicts that had meaning behind them, right? It was fighting against evil in the Second World War. The Cold War is fighting against communism, and capitalism didn't have, much of an ideology, a defining ideology. I mean, it did, obviously, but you had the Soviet Union that was saying the same sort of thing, like chicken in every pot kind of thing. So, how do you define why you were good? Well, we were not that. We were freedom because we knew what unfreedom was, and so on. So the Berlin Wall falls, and capitalism has this crisis of legitimacy. And people were, those in power were trying to like trump up all kinds of junk, trying to find a purpose for society. So my first book, I talked about like they tried to bring up happiness. Oh, our societies are going to be on gross national happiness. And it just struck people as so stupid and cynical and dumb. What a dumb sort of way to kind of just trump up an ideology out of nowhere. Why? Because ideology has to have some kind of material foundation, and at least if I was thinking like perhaps it is a bit progressive to be like neo-colonialist and be like trying to develop some material foundation on which an ideology might be built. So people are so cynical now because they've had so much crap thrown at them like, hey, here's my next big idea, this should be your meaning in life, and this should matter to you, and psychology should matter, mental health should matter to you, freedom, democracy, and everybody knows it's a bunch of junk. You can't just come up with an ideology. You can't. You have to be cynical, and that speaks to people. That is very truthful. And from there, depending on the fruits of it, maybe you can build something worth living for, worth fighting for.
I really want to commend an essay that appeared in Foreign Policy, a rare recommendation that you read something other than Compact, by Peter Slezkine, a man who works at the Simpson Center in Washington, D.C. And his article, The Case for the Greater West, lays out at some length what a kind of non-ideological defense of U.S. empire might look like. So if you want a kind of view of how that might be explained or justified and what its benefits might be, I would look at The Case for the Greater West by Peter Slezkine. So Ashley, tell us a little bit more about your response to Mark Carney's victory. How elated are you as a Canadian, or how dejected?
So I mean, I was obviously not surprised. The day of the election, I suppose it was in Canada, I had a very lengthy argument with my boomer dad, who's actually belatedly become a boomer. I remember when I was a kid, I was like, Daddy, are you a boomer? And he was like, no. But now he is. Anyway, so I was talking to my boomer dad, and of course he was freaking out about Trump, and I was trying to, desperately to have a sort of nuanced conversation with him, and he was just really mad about demagogues. He's going on about demagogues. I'm like, well, what would the world look like without Trump? And he's just like, demagogues, hate demagogues. Anyway, so that's my insight into the boomer mind. And he said, I gotta go and vote. And there was no, so he let go of the conversation. He went to vote, and there's no, mystery over who he voted for. And the Canadian election was basically a referendum about Trump, which was quite smart. But it kind of signified this complete lack of any, I mean, unsurprising, this complete lack of any principle on the part of the Liberals. That they, the one big thing that Polyev had going for him was that he was going to get rid of these the sort of climate what do you call it, the climate taxes, basically, which have been causing a huge amount of unrest in Canada for quite some time. And Carney immediately says, I'm going to do that. He does that. He takes away, Polyev has nothing in his hands anymore. He's got no cards to play. And he looked like someone who would sell Canada to the United States. And so you had this kind of opportunistic, quote, quasi-nationalism that, you know, won the day, obviously, and it's a stunning indictment of the conservatives that they basically, it was so clear that they had this election, 3 months ago or whatever, and not only did they lose it, he lost his seat. Like it was that bad, that badly blown. On the other hand, the
Oh,
Liberals do
really?
have a
I mean, forgive me for not following Canadian politics more closely, but I didn't realize he had lost his seat.
as far as I have heard.
Wow, that's remarkable.
Yeah. It's yeah. So it was a stunning loss. On the other hand, like the Liberals are like slim. Like, it was a stunning loss,
Hmm.
but it wasn't like a landslide win or anything like that. So for me, how I understood it is that you have a lot of bubbling discontent in Canada, and then you had this guy who had just enough of an edge to let some of the steam off, and that was enough. That was enough to kind of get him over the line. So you have like, oh, I'll be a little bit edgy, I'll get rid of this thing that you don't like, and I'll not speak with the same kind of pretty polished PR that you're used to, but I'm still going to be just kind of progressive enough. And but it's so unprincipled. There's nothing underlying it. It was just total opportunism. And you have to say, from a political perspective, that's smart. That was the right thing to do. But for me, it's the same kind of thing. It reminded me a little bit of Syriza. So you had this right now. You have this kind of global vibe shift. I don't think anybody's saying that anymore, but I am. And those in power, the elites of the world, the sort of the Mark Carneys of the world, the Ursula von der Leyens, they all kind of stood by watching all of this, and it looked like they were going to play ball. That they were going to play ball with Trump and that sort of thing. It was sort of, they were playing nice. But really, what they were doing was they were regrouping. They were scheming, planning, and I mentioned it. It reminded me of Syriza, where they kind of like sat there, slightly bemused, arms folded, while the electorate seemed to get what they wanted. And then when they came to, when famously when Varoufakis goes to the EU, they looked at him like he was an idiot, like he was a child, and they were the adults in the room, is the famous phrase. And Carney's like one of these adults in the room. So you've got things are they watched, things are getting a little out of hand. Polyev starts coming up. Oh, we've got a Canadian Trump. We need to put an end to this. And Carney is the perfect kind of figure to come in to be that adult in the room. Now he's an adult who's like maybe you're like Cub Scout leader or something, but like he's still an adult. And he puts on this sort of look, I'm going to be the kind of person who knows how to run a country. And Trump doesn't look like the kind of person, from a Canadian perspective, who knows how to run a country. In fact, even to Americans, I think it's looking kind of scary at the moment. We'll see how things go. But only the most sort of ardent defender of Trump is 100% wonderfully optimistic, to the extent that when I was watching the 100 Days coverage, it reminded me of like the USSR or something, where it was like, glorious leader has had the most glorious 100 days in the history. Our 5-year plans are going excellently. Record tractor production. It was like so mad, so utterly nuts. That
This is the best
Canadians,
Donald Trump I've seen. He's never been more acute. What did Joe Scarborough say about Biden?
It was
This is the best Trump I've seen.
It was just so ridiculous. So from a Canadian perspective, he looks sane. Now you don't want someone too sane, right? You don't want that everybody knows the PR slick people. We don't want that anymore. And he's just enough of an edge. So yeah, but boy, Twitter was mad. I posted that our article from Leela. And I got a lot of deflected heat because nobody wanted any analysis that said, look, this was a smart move, and they have proven themselves able to lead, for better or for worse, more than Polyev did. And I think that was right. And it made me go, damn it, she is right.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add on it. I do remember early on when there was great optimism for Polyev. He was talking to someone in the media while eating an apple or something and walking around out in the country. And this was a much heralded viral clip because he was, seemingly at ease and in his element while kind of easily batting away press questions. But I wasn't totally taken by the Polyev magic. And yeah, it seems, I don't know, there's almost this kind of pattern of celebrated right-wing figures who seem like they're going to be very capable and have broad appeal, and then they really quickly fade when they're subjected to the most intense competition. And I'm thinking of Scott Walker, the former governor of Wisconsin, who was once a celebrated GOP presidential contender. Then Ron DeSantis, who's and both Walker and DeSantis have very considerable achievements as governor. And somehow Poilievre just seemed to fit into the same mold of likable enough conservative guy, but not really charismatic enough to win.
Yeah, I will just echo Phil Cunliffe's take on this election, which appeared in our pages yesterday, how Trump won the Canadian election, which was an unexpected take that was taken as a rebuke of Trump and Trumpism. But as Phil points out, it occurred through a reassertion of national sovereignty over and against, Trump's. And he had a nice comment in there, which was, that Justin Trudeau, soon after taking office, had sort of declared Canada a post-national nation or post-national state. And so, as Cunliffe points out, perhaps Trump was simply taking this literally. It's like, well, it's post-national. Why shouldn't it be part of the U.S.? So I think, it points to something kind of interesting here, which is that, the part of the Trump effect is to, produce these kind of reconsiderations, and that, a kind of Trumpian reassertion of national sovereignty in this case, over and against post-nationalism, right? In this case is actually manifesting as a rebuke of Trump. Now, I suppose something that's kind of odd here is that, which ties into this, which Cunliffe doesn't get into, is, the question of whether Trump 2.0 is presenting something a bit different than Trump 1.0, right? Who was all about borders and the reassertion of the nation. Whereas Trump 2.0 is suddenly very interested in things like the, reasserting U.S. control of the Panama Canal Zone, these other kind of imperial adventures that he's intrigued by. And, I remember seeing this after he first kind of raised the, let's take over Canada thing. I remember seeing some MAGA influencers posting this map in which the U.S., was actually all of North America was the U.S. And I pointed out to them at the time, wow, this is an interesting place to go from build the wall to, because, these maps actually showed Mexico being annexed by the United States. It's like, it's an interesting way to go from build the wall to, abolish the border, sort of dissolve the border between Canada and Mexico. And then they would sort of say, well, it wouldn't really be that way. And, what I pointed out was essentially what one challenge on this, what they seem to be proposing, was that Mexico become the West Bank, that basically we turn it into a kind of quasi-apartheid situation where there are sort of U.S. military-controlled zones, and then the rest of it is just kind of walled off.
Hardcore Mennonite settlers slowly encroaching.
Which you've already got, Mennonites, Mormons, exactly. So, anyway, the point is, it seems that there's a weird reversal, is what I'm suggesting here, which is that Trump, is now playing with the bound. I mean, he's actually repeatedly asserted with regard to Canada that the border is arbitrary, right? Which is amazing. He keeps describing the U.S.-Canadian border as arbitrary, right? Which is a sort of standard open borders kind of argument. And so, what's kind of fascinating is to see the liberal internationalists are now picking up on the national sovereignty thing, whereas now Trump is sort of playing with some kind of new post-national vision.
I'm going to be disappointed if this doesn't end with Marjorie Taylor Greene dressed in white, kneeling at the Canadian border and crying, as in the famous image of AOC crying next to some wire fence supposedly having to do with border enforcement.
Yeah.
It's interesting because I keep saying like Trump is so communist, he doesn't know it. Like he's, he's doing open borders. We're getting 5 year, about the 5 year plan of the glorious leaders has been a stunning success, et cetera, et cetera. No, but I mean, yeah, yes, this makes sense, but for Canada to be reasserting its national sovereignty, maybe, or is it reasserting some kind of nationalism in the sense of a kind of weak national pride? Because in that sense, what is our nationalism and our national pride? It is our internationalism. So there's all this talk of like moving closer to the EU and uh, Carney giving this kind of eulogy to the close trading relationship with the US and looking elsewhere to build deeper relationships with the EU. It's a bit like Scottish, or not Scottish, maybe Scottish, but like some of the European independence movements or British independence movements that really just wanted independence so that they could join the EU. So they're like, oh yes, our sovereignty to go join another sovereign somewhere else, that it will also distance governance from the everyday person. So it makes a nice reversal, but I do wonder how real it is. I think it was just sort of like wounded pride, because the one thing that Canadians have as their identity, quite famously, is that we are not American. I don't know what I am, but I know I'm not them. So this idea that we would join the United States would hit at the soul of every Canadian, because we like to go abroad, sound just like you guys, but say no, je suis Canadienne. No, I am not one of these people, right? To suggest that we could be one, but we would like to be European. We would like these closer relationships. We would gladly give up our sovereignty to the EU. I mean, not everybody, obviously, but a slim majority, I think. So I'm not so certain, how much global elites are really in on sovereignty. The rhetoric of it, maybe to win an election, but in the long term, absolutely not.
Well, if you join the EU, perhaps you can be integrated into the European electrical grid, which Spain was disconnected from this week as it faced a mass power outage. Emmett Penny, an expert in these matters, wrote on it for Compact, and he tied it to Spain's embrace of renewables. The Wall Street Journal has reported that at the time of the power outage, about 69% of Spain's total power was being provided by wind and solar. And the journal, along with other publications, have supported Penny's analysis, which is really about the technical aspects of renewable energy. The fact that when they go offline more suddenly than some other aspects of power, making it harder to adjust and to keep a constant flow of electricity running. And then, of course, these renewables, wind and solar, are more intermittent. They're on at sometimes and off at others, which I, as a non-expert, though the son of an electrician, would tend to think raises more problems in terms of going online and offline, just because you'll be getting power from it at some points and not from others. Whereas with whether it's hydro or nuclear or some kind of dirtier source of power, you could probably have a more constant flow of energy. So is this our first green blackout?
Probably not. And it's amazing to me that I keep saying I'm a conspiracy theorist sometimes at heart, and I'm like, how have countries allowed themselves? It's so bizarre to get into this situation, to actually back away from the most realistic source of power for industrial, modern industrial society, nuclear, and put themselves at risk of this kind of thing. Is just shocking to me, absolutely shocking to me. The week before this happened, there was almost celebrations that almost, what was it, 100% of Spain's energy was coming from renewables, and the very next week the lights go out. And then on social media, I don't know if you saw this, was being sort of flooded with videos of like, what's it like in Spain right now? And it's a bit like everybody walks outside and rubs their eyes and the sun is shining and the birds are tweeting and the children are playing and they all go into the town square and they're playing like impromptu footy with each other. It just struck me as like extremely weird. But a part of me was like, that does look nice. Perhaps they could just shut the power off on Fridays. Sunny Fridays. Could that be like I'm gonna go all in on the environmentalism here. I'll be like, all right, let's actually conserve power.
I like it.
Just Fridays. I want that, please.
The details of this are unclear, but it's something Emmett has written about for years, and others have written about, that it's simply inevitable that this kind of thing will happen once you reach a certain level of reliance on non-constant sources of energy. The sun doesn't always shine, the wind doesn't always blow, and so having a functional grid requires there to be a kind of constant flow. And so the sort of dirty secret of the renewables economy, which it's not really that secret, but the irony in terms of what has actually happened is that it's largely been made possible by the rise of natural gas, specifically through the fracking boom that occurred in the past 10 or 15 years, at least in the US and Canada, I believe, where there was a huge opening up of new fossil fuel resources, which hugely increased the share of natural gas in providing electricity to the grid. And this went along with the expansion of renewables and kind of enabled it, because since renewables cannot provide that kind of steady flow, there needs to be some other source underlying it. And that was natural gas, which, again, has become a huge new energy source, much more so than renewables in the past couple decades. And there are lots of interesting kind of complexities and ironies around this. It has to do with why, with the Nord Stream pipeline and the way that, interestingly, the German Green Party, kind of spearheaded the dismantling of their nuclear power sources, while at the same time making Germany extremely dependent on inflow of Russian natural gas through these pipelines. And so it's an odd thing it's an odd thing, right, that the expansion of renewables is kind of inconceivable without this expansion of natural gas, which largely, again, comes through things like fracking, which people on the green left tend not to like. And so that basically means we're kind of, seeing that if you reduce your other energy sources, especially in Europe, nuclear, and increase the share of renewables, and then are reliant on natural gas, which has to be imported. So with the Ukraine war, the vulnerabilities of that became clear. You're just going to have a much less reliable grid. Now, Emmett doesn't go into this in this piece, but he's written about it before. For the original green movement, this was actually desirable, right? They thought that sort of having a reliable grid was, an example of the kind of corrupting effects of civilization. And so it was actually better to return to a situation of greater scarcity. And they were explicit about this, right? That there was some kind of, hubris in wanting to have a reliable electrical grid. And so it's not that necessarily the green leaders will say this sort of thing explicitly today, but they will, that implicit in this whole project is, and going back to its origins, is the idea that we need to, be able to subsist with less. And that means, if we have a less reliable source of electricity, then that means we're less kind of spoiled and ruined by civilization and its excesses.
I want to ask you about that, Geoff, because we've been hearing in recent weeks, and we've discussed on this podcast the thesis of Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson in their book Abundance, that progressives should get behind an agenda of offering more, basically. And they really are keen on green initiatives and green measures in their book. So, uh, is there some kind of unacknowledged tension in their project with their embrace of kind of green policies intended to address climate change and the actual way that a green agenda cashes out politically or practically?
It's a good question. I mean, they don't, I've read the book, they don't go that deep into sort of energy sources. I'm guessing, I can't remember to what extent it comes up. I'm guessing they would be on the more pro-nuclear side. So at least that would, you know, the question is, if you want to have energy abundance, where is it coming? Or if you want to have a functional sort of grid, electricity grid at all, like where is that coming from? And then the other question is, if you're going to do things like electrify vehicles, I mean, it's quite bizarre to me how little people talked about this. When EVs were first being promoted and subsidized as this great panacea, is like, okay, well, then you're having a greater demand for electricity, rather than if you're essentially replacing gas from the pump with electricity. And people who have I know people who have these EVs. You have to charge them all the time. They have to charge them for long periods. It's quite annoying at this point, because of limitations on batteries. But the point is, this is going to, let's say you replace 50% of cars with EVs tomorrow. Well, this is going to put a massive increase in demand on the electricity grids. So then where is that electricity coming from? And I think Emmett would say, and I'd say a lot of my knowledge of this comes from reading him and knowing him. Just that there isn't very much seriousness about this question on the progressive side of the spectrum. And so I'd say, having read Abundance, one thing that's notable is just that they don't go into, okay, how are we going to generate the electricity needed for this future? I think Klein and Thompson wouldn't be anti-nuclear, but I don't think that they, that there are sort of, there are questions to be answered here about, how you actually generate the base level of abundance, which is, just power to power all of these technologies that they see as part of the future. And so it just seems like there isn't enough of a serious consideration of that. Now, seemingly that you could say that's true to some extent on the right too, because having promised, to unleash energy production. And I think, the Secretary of Energy, Chris Wright, is someone who has a kind of, orientation towards, exploiting all sources of energy, including nuclear, geothermal. Like, he's not just a fossil fuel guy, but he has been hampered by kind of Doge and some of these seemingly not, seemingly somewhat mindless efforts to simply cut parts of the government, because there's an important kind of loan program that has to do with de-risking, various kinds of new energy projects that the Trump administration has been trying to cut, trying to get rid of. And, people can check out, I believe Emma may have written a bit about this elsewhere, but Thomas Hochman is another person who's written about this and how it really does, that there are cuts being pursued by this administration that cut against their ostensible desire to produce more sources of energy. And so the point is, I think across the spectrum, you could say there's not really a seriousness about what would be required to actually generate the power needed to power an expanding sort of technological economy.
I'm very surprised that Musk, for all of his techno-futurism, hasn't suggested that we move from a type 1 to a type 2 society on the, what's it called, the Kardashev scale, where we are able to directly harness the energy from our planet star instead of, being happy to settle for the energy that's just on this planet. I mean, what a lack of vision. You need a Dyson sphere around the sun. That was the big important point that I was going to make. But why aren't we looking to our star directly, not just our crappy solar panels? Come on.
Absolutely. Oh, and we need to go get working on the Dyson Sphere. So we're going to sign off here. Thanks, Jeff. Thank you, Ashley. And thanks to our listeners. Go to compactmag.com/subscribe. You can read Emmett Penny on the Spanish power grid, read Philip Cunliffe, read Layla Shui on Canada's elections, and so much more.